Hi everyone, I want to go over Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, so let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so Chaucer was born approximately 1343 and lived until 1400. We know that. I think October 25th. And then, so basically, he was kind of a unique individual because he was part of sort of the middle class. There's all this really strict social hierarchy within medieval England, and basically, like you had clergy, you had nobility, and then you had everybody else. And so Chaucer is the son of a wealthy wine merchant. And this put him in like a unique position because he is starting to get sort of familiar with nobility. Like he was able to, his father, instead of having him apprentice as a wine merchant, actually sent him to a noble family. I think it was like the spare of Edward III, and or a spare of Edward III, in other words, not his first son. And he ended up making a lot of progress towards becoming, moving up in his social ranking. Um, and then I have some other kind of fun bio stuff in here because we do know a little bit more about Chaucer, so I want to include stuff that, we didn't really get to talk about with some of our other writers, right? So he was captured by the French when he was fighting, for the British, and was ransomed by Edward III. He worked for Edward's personal household. He went on diplomatic missions to Spain, France, and Italy, and we can attribute some of this travel to him getting exposed to literature that influenced him, particularly in Italy. And then he worked as controller of customs and did taxes for the kingdom. So these are like just a few highlights. He also married well. His what am I This is so weird talking about class because like it just isn't, it's not as relevant, right? And it's also just kind of feels gross. But he one of the books that I was reading said that within 3 generations of his family, they moved from being considered commoners to being considered like nobility. And that wasn't really a thing before. All right. So thinking about his legacy, he is referred to as, like the father of English literature, English verse. He's considered the most important English writer before Shakespeare. And so, what's kind of important to know about him is that he chose to write in vernacular English. And so, thinking back to like our history and everything, a lot of um, a lot of the court and a lot of the writing and speaking that was done, in law and things like that was in French, right? There's like a major French, I mean, there was the Anglo-Norman time period, right? And so this is we're transitioning out. And so other writers at this time were writing in multiple languages, including sometimes English, but Chaucer is really considered sort of the one who chose to write in English, did it, and now, kind of people followed after his lead. He's the first writer who was interred in Poets' Corner. If you've been to Westminster Abbey, there's a spot for him there, a little shrine for him. I'm not sure that's the right word. I feel like this class is really showing how much I don't know about, Christianity, certain forms of Christianity at least. And then another thing is many of his poems are dream poems. Like if we look at his whole, like what he composed in his lifetime, and he was a civil servant, and so he wasn't as prolific as he might have been potentially, right? Because he wasn't just like one of these people who got to just write all the time. Um, so a lot of his works were written, a little bit later in his life, and a lot of them were dream poems. His most famous poems or his most famous works, I guess, are the Canterbury Tales, which we're going to be reading. Those are by far the most read and very, very famous, right? Especially in English literature. The other one that's really famous, though, is Troilus and Cressida. And I'm not sure if anyone has read this, but it is based on, it's based on if you like mythology, if you like reading stuff, from like Greek and Roman mythology and history, you might like this one. It's kind of like, and Shakespeare did later adapt it. It's kind of like Romeo and Juliet in some ways. It's like young lovers who are separated and well, I don't know. I guess I'll spoil it for you. It's like, a really long time after it was written. But she betrays him basically. She like promises that she'll return and then she betrays him. And so there was some there's been some speculation too that because he wrote that story, one of his patrons might have asked him to write something that's more positive depiction of women, right? Okay. So let's talk about the Canterbury Tales. So it seems like he had planned, and it's hard to know because we have 80, I think it was 80 surviving manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales. The one that we use is the Ellesmere manuscript. That's the one that most people consider to be like the one that's most faithful or complete, I guess. It only has 22 stories in it, or I guess 22 and two that are incomplete. So 24. And then, but it seems like Chaucer intended to have 120 stories in it based on stuff that we see in like the prologue and the ending. It seems like the intention was to have each of the pilgrims give a story or give two stories on the way there and back, and there's 30 pilgrims. So anyway, so that he did not get there, but we still have a lot of it. And then it's kind of interesting thinking about what inspired him to do this or why this is such an important work. One of the things that I read was that when he was living in Greenwich, sorry, uh, he lived near a pilgrim road to Thomas Becket's shrine. And so there's this idea that maybe he saw pilgrims passing by, and that inspired him. One thing to kind of note is that, but back to that social status thing, that class stuff that I was talking about earlier, um, people of these different classes would not have been traveling together, in this way. They wouldn't have been like talking to each other this way, and they definitely wouldn't have been like telling stories and verses like this. Um, and so, at least not all of them. So it is kind of like more fantastical, I think, than it seems. But it was interesting because of a lot of what people talk about with Chaucer and with this, with him writing this, is this idea of like who else could have had this kind of perspective of different social classes better than Chaucer because he had so much in his background. Uh, considered a commoner, but then his daughter married a duke. So, it's like he really had a lot of social mobility, and was interacting with people of different social classes in ways that probably did help inform him, and give him a sense of kind of like the truth behind, some of the romanticism that we might see from other writers. Um, all right, so I want to point out that the Canterbury Tales is a work of satire. And so satire basically, and I have some links here to kind of, if you want to get more oriented with this term, it's going to be an artistic form, chiefly literary, in which human or individual vices, follies, abuses, or shortcomings are held up to censure by means of ridicule, derision, burlesque, irony, parody, caricature, or other methods, sometimes with an intent to inspire social reform. And basically, what we're talking about here is satire is sort of like a um uh comedic like revelation of the sins of whatever, of whoever, right? It's like a way of and I'm like completely blanking on the term I'm looking for here, but it's like muckraking or this kind of stuff where you're sort of revealing something that go about someone that goes against who they're supposed to be, right? And the idea here, again, often is towards social reform. I'm not totally sure that's what Chaucer's goal was here. It seems like he's definitely getting people to think, though, right? And so I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that he seems to be kind of chiming in on, conversations that are going on in society that it's hard to tell how popular his take is, if this was like a super hot take. But I think even now it's inspired so much conversation that we have to wonder, like, was this just like completely groundbreaking or shocking or, whatever? It seems it was popular. So I think that's a pretty good indication. So the other thing to note about this is it's an estates satire more specifically. And what that basically means is that it is satire kind of critiquing the this idea of the estates of the realm, which is a social structure of the Middle Ages, like I was saying. And so if you want to learn more about that, you can click on these links. All right. Canterbury Tales. So let's get into the tales and the prologue. So again, we're seeing a frame narrative here, and what that means is that we have this story about these people who are pilgrims and they're traveling together to, the Canterbury Cathedral or the shrine of, Becket or whatever. But beyond that story, each of them is telling a story, right? So they each have these stories that they're sharing, and we have sort of this like um this way of explaining how how we're gonna compile all these stories together is that there's this frame narrative that's keeping them all together, right? And so each of the pilgrims tells a story, and then that story is somehow related to that pilgrim. It's a really cool idea, I think, actually. And it seems like Chaucer was probably like, pretty inventive. There's a lot of that he's deriving his ideas from. Like in each of the tales is definitely like influenced by other stories. Um, but the idea of pilgrims seems to be unique, or at least somewhat unique, right? The way that he's doing it. So back to the prologue, the first 18 lines of the prologue are frequently excerpted and memorized. And so I had to memorize them in high school and recite them in front of everyone. And kind of notably, you have to say it in Middle English usually. And so if you're curious about what that sounds like, or if you had to do that, you can reminisce by clicking this link, and it's going to have a video of somebody doing it. And then finally, I wanted to give you a little bit of, I know I didn't assign a ton of reading this week because I wanted to give you a little bit more breadth than depth with these stories potentially. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to see how the prologue describes the wife of Bath and the partner, because at the beginning of the book, he describes these characters who are part of this pilgrimage party. And I think that knowing about how they're perceived by others can give you a good sense of like what Chaucer is trying to say through their stories. And a lot of times, keep in mind, because this is a satire, there's going to be a conflict with, or there's going to be some like interesting relationship between the story the person is telling and who they are, right? And I think especially with the two we're looking at today. So looking at the partner's tale, um, so just kind of like a little bit of history here. Partners were given license by the Pope to grant indulgences, or to sell indulgences, I should say, pardoning sins to a certain extent, where you're lessening punishment for that sin, right? And this is something that I think you could probably imagine. It had to be really regulated. There's rules about like, you know, when you can preach and where you can preach, and the money is supposed to go to charities like hospitals. But there is sort of a reputation with partners, as you might imagine from reading the story, where they were giving these very emotional sermons. And if you were if you're like me and you get a little suspicious when people start using a ton of pathos, um, then yeah, I mean, you can imagine how potentially people see them as like just trying to take money from people however they can. And the partner is certainly corrupt. That is definitely what Chaucer is saying about him. In his prologue, he actually brags about his corruption. He says, "For my intention is only to make profit and not at all for correction of sin." And so he is not really beating around the bush there. He is saying, "All I care about is money. I don't I don't care about this forgiveness of sin." Okay. Um, And I will say too, I feel like the partner and the wife of Bath are two of the figures in this story who are considered maybe some of the most interesting. Um, there are a lot of scholars who have things to say about the partner's identity, especially the way he's described in the prologue, and like especially related to things like his sexuality. And it's just because there's a lot. He's definitely given into vices, and so there's some kinds of disagreements about his sexuality, and then that informs the way that people potentially interpret what he's saying, right? Is he like lecherous? Some people think he's gay. Some people think he is. So yeah, but basically, there's a lot if you want to read more about that. So basically, in The Partner's Tale, he talks for 200 lines almost before he finally says, "But sirs, now I will tell forth my tale." Now, I gave you a link to an abridged version of this story, and so you might be like, "What are you talking about?" I think it's only like six. It might not even be any, but I think it might be like 16 lines in the one that I gave you, where he's like preaching and he's like, "And another thing." And another thing, and he's like talking about drunkenness and greed, and like he's just going through all of these vices and talking about how important it is to, how corrupt people are and how important it is to ask for forgiveness. All right. Anyway, he finally gets to his story, and what we would call this story is an exemplum, a brief story told to illustrate a moral point. And so, this is pretty common for sermons. And if you want to learn more about that, I've got a link there. All right, so let's talk about the plot. The plot is that there's these three men. They are, seeming to live a party lifestyle, and they decide that they want to kill Death. And I believe it's because he killed an associate of theirs, right? And so that like one of their associates died. So they meet this old man in the tower, and he's all wrapped up except his face, and they're like, "You're a spy of Death. We know it. You're trying to, help him get us too." And the guy says, "Well, actually, I know where Death is. He's waiting under that tree. You should go kill him. If you have a problem with him, you should go, confront him there." And they do. They go to the tree and they find treasure there. And then two of the guys are like, "Hey, youngest person, you should go get us some food and wine, because we are going to need to wait here until nighttime, because we can't just like walk out of here with all this treasure." So then the young one goes, and then while the young one's in town, he's like, "Whoa, it'd be great keeping all this treasure for myself." So he poisons the wine, and then he gets back. When he gets back, the other two guys kill him because, of course, they also decided that they want all of the treasure. And then they drink the wine because they're like, "Woohoo, let's celebrate. Let's have our food that he brought us back before we transport this stuff." And so they drink the wine and they all die, right? So, inspiring. But if you want to learn more about this story, or some of the things, the conversations around it, you can follow this link here to the Harvard page. Harvard has all of the stories, prologues, intros, everything put out in both Middle English and translation. And so it can be really great. But they also have like kind of they break down each of the tales and most of the prologues too, or many of the prologues, I guess I should say. And so if you have any questions, or if you need a refresher, it might be a good place to go. All right, Wife Bath. So we've talked a little bit about women in the Middle Ages. Wife of Bath, I think, is a really interesting character. Again, she's one of the characters in the Canterbury Tales that I think people have the most to say about. She is more fully developed, I think, than most of the other characters, but she is still kind of, I feel like a tool. This is a satire, right? And Chaucer he has things to say about society. And so we're gonna see what he has to say, right? Um, and so it seems like he wants to engage with conversations surrounding marriage and women in particular, and just kind of a really brief overview. The medieval church is going to have a lot of anti-feminist messaging, and frankly misogynist messaging, and they're pretty anti-marriage, which is kind of interesting. Um, if we look at this quote this is from the Norton Anthology, they say the church considered men rational, intellectual, spiritual, and superior, while women were irrational, material, earthly, and inferior. I think I talked a little bit about that when we were talking about Marjorie Kemp, and Julian of Norwich, right? Because the way that those women were able to kind of get around this perception of women and the idea that women couldn't possibly have anything to say about like the Bible or God was that they had these sort of very physical manifestations of their spirituality, right, and of their spiritual experience. And so I think we can see Chaucer seems to have some things to say about that. The wife of Bath seems very well read, very knowledgeable, very smart, and at the same time, though, she is very lusty, and she seems honestly, she talks about sex a lot and very frankly, and so that seems to be kind of connected more to like the material earthly, right, in a way that men apparently were not considered to be at that time. Okay, so like I said, there's this idea of maybe marriage being a bad thing. And we can see here, and again from the Norton, St. Paul and the early church fathers exalted celibacy and virginity over marriage. And basically they basically were like, well, marriage is like a necessary evil, like a necessary bad thing, right? Because yeah, I guess we have to have marriage, but it was like very reluctant. And then in the fourth century, we know that a monk named Jovinian wrote a tract in which he apparently presented marriage as a positive good rather than a necessary evil. And the only way we even know about that is because Saint Jerome absolutely attacked it mercilessly. And so if you're curious at all about what Saint Jerome said, you want to hear this anti-feminist rhetoric, you can look over here. I included a link. But let's get into the prologue. So it's really long. Again, I gave you an excerpt, a very abridged version. If you want to read the longer version, you absolutely can. I would check out the Harvard website. They have the bilingual version of it. It's the longest of the prologues, and it's twice as long as her tale, almost. Or wait, more than? I think it's more than twice as long as her tale. I did the math earlier, but I forget. The form of this is an apologia. This is an explanation and defense of one's occupation in life, in her case, marriage. And it's kind of funny because of the fact that this is a satire. I guess it makes sense that we would have these kind of apologia introductions from people where they're defending and explaining, you know, why they are the way that they are. If you want to learn more about that, then you can again read on Harvard. And there's I can share with you some more links too that I didn't know. I was trying to not include so many links that it was overwhelming. So kind of a brief summary here. She was married 5 times. Her first 3 husbands were rich and old, and she was able to, get some material wealth from from those marriages, but it doesn't seem like she has a whole lot to say, that she got from those. Her fourth husband had a mistress. Seems like she really disliked this guy, and, she kind of got revenge on him. And then her fifth husband is her favorite. And I don't think it's like a coincidence what her moral seems to be from the story, from her prologue and from her story. They seem to be very similar. Basically, he gave her full sovereignty in marriage, but that was only after he beat her because and she became deaf actually from when he hit her. She was destroying this book that he loved, the Book of Wicked Wives, and I can't imagine why she didn't like it. So anyway, so she's sort of destroying that book, tearing pages out and everything, and he came in and saw her doing it and beat her. She played dead, And once he felt bad enough, she was like, okay, cool, let's have a conversation about what the rest of our marriage is going to be like. And so it's just kind of interesting because, uh, you know, I think there's so much to say and has been said. This is obviously like a domestic violence story, and horrifying. At the same time, the way that she seems to use this moment um, to give herself power, to gain power in her marriage is really interesting. I'm sure again, there's a lot written about this if you want to learn more. So let's get into some of these tropes and some of the terminology that would be useful for this story. So when we're looking at her tale, we're looking at an Arthurian romance, in other words, or legend. In other words, this is a story about one of Arthur's knights, right? We're in the time of King Arthur. Um, and this story is really similar to Landval by de France. And I don't know why I didn't assign Landval. I guess just because there's so many things I couldn't assign that I like, and that I think are important. That's one that if you have the time, man, please take a minute and read it. I linked to it there. It's so good. But it is, I don't think we're gonna have time this semester, unfortunately. Um, so some other terms that could be useful here, chivalric romance and courtly love. So basically, we're looking at this time period, in this genre where we have knights and they go on quests to prove their loyalty or prove their love to some noble woman. And they go on all these like adventures and they're tested and blah blah blah. This one is kind of changing that a little bit, right? And it's not like Chaucer got this out of nowhere. It's definitely like influenced by their stories and things, but instead of this knight being noble, he's like a rapist, which, I mean, that's like one of the first things we learn about him. And he's sentenced to death, right? I'm getting a little bit into the storyline here, but long story short, he goes on a quest to kind of absolve himself to get away from the death penalty. And in the process, he meets this ugly hag. Now, and I'm sorry, because I am going to refer to her in like the meanest ways, because that's how she's portrayed, not because I think it's okay to describe women that way. So she is what is considered part of the loathly lady trope. And there was there's a lot written on this, but the idea here is she's a shape-shifting female who transforms from great beauty to intense ugliness in relation to a character test of the male protagonist. Okay, and so I got this from an encyclopedia of like medieval literature, but if you want to learn more, you can click here. But basically, yeah, this is a trope. We see this a lot. And I was even thinking of Beauty and the Beast. So, I mean, this really goes into contemporary stuff and it goes really far back too. But we see this particularly around this time period. And you can see other examples as well. I don't think this is on the bingo card or anything. I just thought it was interesting. And so if you're at all interested in these kinds of tropes, it might be worth looking into. All right, so let's get into this plot. Um, like I said, Arthur's one of Arthur's knights, and he's like an unnamed knight. It's not like he's important. He rapes a woman and is sentenced to death. Guinevere offers to let him live if he can find out what do women want, right? It's like that Mel Gibson movie. Yikes. Okay. He goes on a quest to find the answer, and he finally meets an old hag. And I literally wrote yikes because I hate writing it. And he's basically like at his wit's end. He has tried to find the answer. He can't find it. She says, "Look, I'll tell you the answer, but only if you do me a favor." And he's like, "Great, no problem." They go to Guinevere. He tells her the answer to what women want, which is sovereignty in marriage, right? Or sovereignty over their husbands. And Guinevere's like, "Great, I guess you can live." Now, this is when the hag calls in her favor and she's like, "Great, I would love to marry you." And he has made it a deal. And so he goes through with it, basically not having any option. And also, she did just save his life. And so he's upset though, and he tells her he's a real charmer. He says, you're old and ugly and of low birth, right? You're not noble. And so it's so shameful for me to marry you. And she, instead of, responding in a way that seems more logical to me. She wants to be married to him, right? For whatever reason. So she offers him the choice. He can have her old and ugly and faithful, right? Old and ugly and faithful, or young, beautiful, and possibly unchaste. Okay. And so at this point, it seems like a real dilemma. Like he'd probably choose for her to be young and beautiful, even if she's unfaithful. But he tells her to choose. And here's how he demonstrates that he has learned the lesson, the moral of the story, what women want, which is sovereignty in marriage. And so then she gives him everything he wants. She turns into a beautiful woman, and they live happily ever after. Reading this today, I'm kind of like, man, is this a happy ending? But I don't think I typically have my romances starting with someone committing rape. So anyway, so I think though that isn't an accident. I think Chaucer doesn't want this to be like or at least the manuscript that we have considered is like the best manuscript, doesn't want this to be an easy romance, like one that is just like satisfying and happy, and celebrates nobility. I think that this is a romance. And there's a line too that I've left out, where she talks about how nobility is from like action instead of birth, instead of like from, who your parents are. And so anyway, I think that that's intentional. Okay. So if you want to learn more about the Wife of Bath's plot, I have a couple of links here. I think that's the end. Okay, yeah. I could keep talking. I love Chaucer and I love I love the Canterbury Tales. But let's go ahead and end here. Let me know if you have any questions and I'll see you next week.